At his gala party, the Millionaire CEO was boasting on stage, "I built this fortune on my own." But his arrogant speech was interrupted when the cleaning lady, who everyone despised, got up, took the microphone, and displayed an old confidential photo on the screen. A deadly silence spread throughout the hall. The CEO's face turned pale. The photo not only revealed the criminal origin of his wealth, but what she said next, linking him to a crime from the past, made the guests look at him in shock. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Group, located in downtown Atlanta, shimmered beneath the weight of crystal chandeliers that poured a golden light over the bare shoulders and glittering jewelry of the invited guests. The air thrummed with the low murmur of consequential conversations, the soft clinking of champagne flutes, and the blended aroma of white lilies and designer fragrances. This was the night Rick Sterling, the multimillionaire CEO and architect of a sprawling conglomerate, celebrated his company's 20th anniversary. On the stage, bathed in spotlights, he was the very picture of success, the CEO of the Year trophy weighing heavily in his hands. His smile, perfectly rehearsed for the cameras, was a beacon of fierce self-assurance. He had constructed a narrative of relentless triumph, as solid as the skyscrapers his company erected. A classic tale of a self-made man who had started from absolute zero. His fortune was a testament to his genius and perseverance, a net worth that grew with every positive stock exchange report, where Sterling Group shares were synonymous with guaranteed profit. He saw himself not merely as a rich man, but as a visionary, a titan of industry. "Everyone asks me the secret to my success." His voice, amplified by the sound system, was deep and imbued with the authority that only money can buy. "And I tell them the truth. There is no secret. There is only hard work. I inherited nothing. I had help from nobody. I built this wealth, this empire, with my own hands, from the absolute bottom." Applause erupted, a wave of admiration from men and women who viewed him as the American ideal. As the ovation swelled, a discreet movement, almost invisible at the side of the stage, diverted a few gazes. Mrs. Dolores, the building's longest-serving cleaning woman, a slight woman with white hair pulled back in a simple bun, her shoulders bowed by decades of labor, climbed the steps. Her presence, in her impeccably pressed blue uniform, was a jarring dissonance in that symphony of luxury. She walked with silent determination, her eyes fixed solely on Rick. The interruption was so unexpected that the audience fell silent, and the security detail, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the scene, hesitated. Rick turned, his frozen smile dissolving into a mask of contained fury. "What are you doing?" he hissed, low enough only for her to hear. "Get off the stage now! Security!" But she didn't retreat. Her eyes, which had seen so much within that building, showed no fear, only a deep, ancient sorrow. "You built everything alone, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, ignoring the threat and the security guards now finally moving towards her. With a swift, precise gesture, she took the microphone from his hand, the brief contact of her calloused fingers against his soft, manicured ones, sending an invisible shock through the air. "Alone," she repeated, now for the entire ballroom to hear. Before Rick's rage could explode into action, she pulled a time-yellowed photograph from the pocket of her uniform. "Please," she requested of the technical crew in the sound booth, pointing to the giant screen behind the stage. "Show this to everyone." The technicians, shocked and confused but compelled by the inexplicable authority in her voice, obeyed. The image that filled the screen elicited a collective gasp throughout the room. It showed a thin, 20 years younger Rick, his face still holding a dream, looking both embarrassed and proud in a gas station attendant's uniform. Beside him, an arm over his shoulders, was the beloved late founder of the company, Mr. Arthur Sterling, smiling with the genuine affection of a father. That portrait from the past, so vivid and unexpected, hung over the stunned silence of the ballroom. A bomb about to demolish the present Rick had meticulously constructed. The silence in the ballroom was a physical force, a pressure that seemed to suck all the air away. Mr. Arthur Sterling's smiling face, projected in high definition, was a benevolent ghost, hovering over Rick's tarnished fortune. For an instant, Rick forgot the audience, the partners, the cameras. He was that skinny young man again, the smell of gasoline on his hands and a universe of hope in his eyes. The memory of that day, of that act of paternal warmth from the man who took him in, hit him with the force of a tidal wave. It was a surge of nostalgia so powerful it almost knocked him down, immediately followed by a wave of ice-cold panic that shot up his spine. His house of cards, built with years of lies and a fierce dedication to erasing the past, was crumbling under the weight of a simple photograph. The net worth he was so proud of, the assets he listed with vanity, now seemed like mere dust. The trophy in his hands, once a symbol of his glory, suddenly felt as heavy as a lead anvil, a monument to his fraud. Mrs. Dolores's voice, now choked with emotion but crystalline clear, cut through the silence. "I remember when you first came here 30 years ago," she said, her eyes fixed on his, piercing the decades. "I was Mr. Sterling's assistant. I served coffee in his office every morning." A murmur swept through the audience. They were no longer just party guests. They were witnesses. He gave you a job as a gas station attendant at the one service station the company owned back then. He saw something in you. He saw ambition. He saw intelligence." She paused, and every word seemed carefully chosen, polished by memory. "He paid for your business school tuition, Mr. Sterling. He always said an investment in a good man was safer than any placement in gold or stocks on the exchange. He believed in your potential, believed you would be the future of the Sterling Group." Rick felt cold sweat trickling down his forehead. He looked toward the front row, where his wife, Beatrice, stared at him with wide eyes, confusion giving way to a shadow of horror. Next to her, his principal partner, Charles, a pragmatic man who understood only the language of profit and dividends, had a tight face, his eyes calculating the size of the disaster. Market confidence. The value of his entire business depended on his image, and his image was being unraveled, thread by thread, by a cleaning woman. He needed to do something, to scream, deny, drag her off the stage, but his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed by the truth. Dolores's voice faltered for a moment, overcome by emotion, and she pointed to the photo on the screen. "And I remember this photo. I took it myself, with his old camera. It was the day Mr. Sterling promoted you to manager, and you cried, 'Mr. Sterling.' You wept like a child and swore that he was the father you never had." The revelation of that intimacy, that vulnerability, was more shocking to the audience than any financial scandal. It stripped the billionaire of his armor of arrogance and showed the fragile man he once was. Then, Mrs. Dolores's tone shifted. Nostalgia gave way to a cutting firmness, a pain that had transformed into strength. "But and I also remember what happened when Mr. Sterling fell ill." She lowered the photo, the movement slow and deliberate, and from the same uniform pocket retrieved a second paper, a folded, fragile document. "I remember how you made him sign papers he didn't understand, transferring all the company's capital into your name, while he was delirious with fever, calling out for his son." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. She lifted the paper, and the hand that had once trembled was now rock steady. "And this is the proof of your betrayal." The paper Mrs. Dolores held was not a simple sheet. It was an artifact of the past, yellowed at the creases, the words written in the shaky handwriting of a man at the end of his strength. For Rick, that document was more terrifying than an abrupt drop in his stock value on the exchange. It was the materialization of his greatest fear, the ghost of a conscience he had spent decades trying to silence with the noise of his success, the shine of his possessions. The cash flow of his life, the narrative of his rise, was about to be publicly audited. Every dollar, every euro that composed his vast net worth now seemed soiled, stained by the ink of that letter. He remembered that hospital room, the smell of antiseptic, Arthur's weak hand holding the pen while he, with the soft voice of a serpent, whispered about bureaucratic procedures and protecting company assets. He had told himself it was a necessary evil, a business maneuver to save the Sterling Group from uncertainty. But deep down, in the dark place where truth hides, he knew it was pure greed. This is the original letter he left for me, his only confidant, the day before he passed away. Mrs. Dolores's voice was a soft thunder, but every syllable echoed with the force of a sentence. And he told me he was being tricked, that the son in whom he placed all his trust was taking everything from him. He wrote here, she pointed to a line on the paper, that he left everything to the bastard son no one knew about, a son he loved in secret his whole life. The mention of an unknown heir caused a new wave of shock in the room. It was a soap opera twist, an intrigue that not even the boldest screenwriter could have conceived for the history of the Sterling Group. The idea of a lost inheritance, of a legitimate owner waiting in the shadows, was more fascinating than any profitability report. Rick's story, the business genius, the man who transformed a small service station into a conglomerate, was being rewritten before everyone, and he was now the villain. Rick tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. He looked at the security guards, who remained motionless, just as captivated as the rest of the audience. They no longer saw a cleaning woman and a CEO. They saw a prophetess and an unmasked king. Power had changed hands. It was no longer with the money, with the status, with the expensive suits. It was with the truth, wielded by the fragile hand of a woman in a uniform. Mrs. Dolores then added the last piece of the puzzle, the sentence that would seal Rick's fate. "Or a son I promised him I would help find." Her gaze shifted from the CEO and swept the audience. As if searching for someone, the tension was unbearable. Every guest felt part of that search, every heartbeat in anticipation of what would come next. At that exact moment, as if choreographed, a man stood up from the 10th row. He did not possess the aura of wealth that emanated from the others. He wore a simple, well-cut suit. But it didn't scream millions. His shoulders were broad, his face marked by a serious but serene expression. There was a calm about him that contrasted violently with the emotional chaos that had settled in the room. He began to walk down the aisle, the sound of his steps muffled by the thick carpet, yet each step resonated like a hammer driving the final nail into the coffin of Rick's reputation. Beside him, discreet but with the unmistakable posture of those who know the law, walked two people holding leather briefcases, his legal counsel. The audience parted, their eyes following that anonymous figure advancing toward the stage, toward his destiny. The man didn't look at anyone. His eyes were locked on Rick with an intensity that seemed to carry the weight of 30 years of absence. The confrontation was inevitable. Leonard's walk from the audience to the stage seemed to last an eternity. For Rick, it was like watching his own ruin approaching in slow motion. Every step the stranger took was a nail being hammered into his reputation. Every yard traveled was a piece of his empire dissolving into dust. The multimillionaire, the man who controlled vast capital and influenced the market with a simple phone call, suddenly felt small, exposed under the lights that once glorified him. The air he breathed felt dense, heavy, and the silence of the ballroom was a deafening buzz in his ears. He looked at the face of the approaching man, and for one terrifying instant, he saw Arthur Sterling's features. Not the obvious resemblance, but the same firmness in the gaze, the same posture of a man who does not bend. It was the ghost of his betrayal, now incarnate, coming to collect the debt. His mind, usually sharp at calculating risks and predicting stock movements, was short-circuiting. The liabilities of his life were suddenly overwhelming the assets. When Leonard finally climbed the steps and stopped on the stage, the contrast between the two men was stark. Rick, in his designer tuxedo and sweat glistening on his forehead, looked like a cornered king. Leonard, in his simpler suit, exuded a calm that was almost an insult. He did not look like a man seeking fortune. He looked like a man seeking justice. Mrs. Dolores, with the dignity of a matriarch, completed the sentence that had been suspended in the air. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and untrembling as she turned to the newcomer, "you did not build anything alone. You stole it, and this is Leonard Sterling, the true owner of everything." The name Sterling dropped onto the ballroom like a bomb. It was the name of the company, the name of the founder, the name Rick had used to build his brand, but which had never truly belonged to him. The shock of the revelation finally broke Rick's paralysis. Adrenaline flooded his system, and the instinct for survival, the same one that had propelled him to the top, took control. "This is preposterous, a farce," he roared into the microphone, his voice hoarse with panic and rage. "This woman is senile, and this man is an imposter, a con artist trying to take advantage of the situation. Security, get these two out of here now." He pointed a trembling finger at Leonard. "What do you want, huh? Money? Shares? Do you want a piece of my wealth? Name your price." He tried to turn the situation into a negotiation, a business deal, the only territory where he felt safe. Leonard stared him down, and for the first time, spoke. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that silenced Rick's attempted fury. "I don't want your money, Rick." The emphasis on your was subtle but cutting. "I want my father's honor back. I want what he built and what he wanted to leave me as an inheritance." He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping the shocked faces. "My father, Arthur Sterling, trusted this man, and he was betrayed." Before Rick could retort, one of the lawyers accompanying Leonard stepped forward. She was a woman of serious, competent appearance. "Mr. Richard Andrade," she said, with a professional voice that brooked no interruption, "my name is Isabel Matthews, and I legally represent Mr. Leonard Sterling." She opened the leather briefcase she carried and took out a document. It was not Mrs. Dolores's letter. It was an official document with seals and notarized signatures. "We have in our possession the original will of Mr. Arthur Sterling, drafted and authenticated 1 week before the papers you coerced him into signing on his hospital bed." She extended the document toward Rick, but did not hand it over. Instead, she took a second sheet from the briefcase, a laboratory report. "And we also have this, something you might want to see before we continue." She placed it delicately on the podium, right in front of Rick's eyes. The entire room held its breath as he lowered his gaze to the paper. It was a DNA test result, and the words 99.9% compatibility shone like searing iron. The numbers 99.9% seemed to leap off the paper and burn Rick's retina. They were cold, clinical, and absolute. There was no arguing against science, no renegotiating genetics. All his assets, every meticulously planned investment, every dollar and euro in his offshore accounts, everything was contaminated by the fraudulent origin of his power. The lab report paper trembled in his hand, a fragile sheet that held the power to demolish the skyscraper of his life. The blood drained from his face, leaving a corpse-like pallor that even the warm stage lighting could not disguise. For a long moment, the only sound he heard was the sharp ringing in his own ears, the sound of his universe imploding. He looked at Leonard, and for the first time, he didn't see an adversary, but the reflection of the man he could have been if he had chosen the path of honor. That simple gas station attendant in the photo was more decent than the billionaire he had become. In the front row, Beatrice's shock solidified into icy comprehension. The diamond necklace on her neck, a birthday gift from Rick, suddenly felt heavy and cold, like a chain. Every luxury, every trip, every piece of art that adorned their house was the fruit of a lie. She was not married to a business genius, but to a thief of dreams. Humiliation enveloped her like a cloak. It wasn't the loss of money or status that hurt her, but the fundamental betrayal, the discovery that the foundation of her life was quicksand. Her gaze met Rick's, and for the first time in 20 years of marriage, she didn't see the man she loved, but a desperate, pathetic stranger. She turned her face away, a subtle gesture, but for Rick it was the final blow. Her contempt was more painful than the loss of all his fortune. Beside Beatrice, Charles, his majority partner, did not see the personal tragedy. He saw a financial disaster of epic proportions. His mind was already calculating the precipitous drop in sterling group shares at the stock exchange opening bell the next morning. He saw investors panicking, creditors knocking, the cash flow drying up. Every contract, every deal, every projection of profit and dividends was now at risk. Rick's image, the Midas who turned everything to gold, dissolved. In his place was a liability, an incalculable risk. Charles's face was a mask of controlled fury. He felt no pity for Rick. He felt rage at the recklessness that threatened to destroy both their holdings. On the stage, Leonard remained silent, allowing the truth to do its work. He didn't need to accuse. The facts spoke for themselves. It was the lawyer, Isabel, who broke the spell. In addition to the will and the DNA test, we have the sworn testimony of 3 former employees of the clinic where Mr. Arthur Sterling spent his last days, she said, her voice resonating with the authority of the law. They attest to the coercion and Mr. Sterling's debilitated health condition when the transfer documents were signed. It was checkmate. There was nowhere left to run. Rick felt the air leave his lungs. The stage, which minutes before was his throne, was now a cage. The audience, which applauded him, was his jury. Instinct told him to run, to disappear, but his legs seemed made of lead. He took a step back, tripping over the pedestal of the trophy, which fell to the floor with a dull metallic crash, the sound echoing through the ballroom like the death knell of his reign. He turned, his eyes fixed on the dark backstage exit, a cornered animal seeking an escape route, but the stares of hundreds of people held him in place, an invisible wall of judgment he couldn't traverse. The crash of the trophy on the floor was the snap that broke the collective hypnosis. The murmur in the ballroom grew, transforming into a feverish buzz. Cell phones were raised, no longer to film a celebration, but to capture a social lynching. The news would spread like wildfire, from society columns to financial news portals. Rick's fortune, once an ocean of stability, was now a tsunami about to engulf everything he had built. The word fraud was already being whispered from mouth to mouth, and he could almost feel the value of his shares melting. His net worth evaporating. With every passing second, he remained paralyzed on that stage. He was no longer Richard Sterling, the billionaire. He was a name associated with a scandal, a footnote in the history of the company he claimed to have created. His legacy was being rewritten as that of a usurper. Amidst the growing chaos, one figure remained a pillar of calm, Mrs. Dolores. She watched Rick's disintegration, not with triumph, but with deep sadness. For her, this wasn't revenge, but the fulfillment of a promise, the restoration of a long-delayed justice. She remembered Rick as the hungry boy, not for food, but for a chance. She had seen Arthur give him that chance and much more, and she had seen that boy's ambition turn into greed, an insatiable appetite for money and power that led him to devour the hand that fed him. Her eyes filled with tears, not for Rick, but for the good man he could have been. That stage was not just the scene of a CEO's downfall, it was the grave of a lost soul. Leonard, for his part, felt the weight of a victory that brought no joy. He had spent years imagining this moment, fueled by the story Mrs. Dolores had told him about the father he barely knew. He had imagined an explosive confrontation, a catharsis. But now, seeing the man in front of him disintegrate, he felt only emptiness. That empire of concrete and glass, the vast capital, the wealth expressed in multiple digits, none of it could fill the absence of a father. He didn't want Rick's ruin. He wanted, somehow, to recover the lost years, to understand the man whose blood ran in his veins. The Sterling Group empire was his inheritance, yes, but it felt more like a burden than a prize. It was a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but one that destiny, through the hands of a loyal cleaning woman, had imposed upon him. Rick finally moved. With visible effort, he straightened up, ignoring the trophy fallen at his feet. His gaze swept the crowd, passing over his wife, his partners, his rivals, who were now smiling discreetly. He saw the contempt, the morbid curiosity, the satisfaction. No one there was his friend. They were just satellites orbiting his power. And now that his sun was setting, they were already searching for a new star to follow. Loneliness hit him with overwhelming force. He was completely, irredeemably alone. With a last shred of pride, he straightened his jacket, an automatic, useless gesture of someone trying to maintain composure while the world collapses. He turned and, without a word, without looking back, walked toward the darkness backstage. He did not run. He walked with the slowness of a condemned man, each step taking him away from the light and plunging him deeper into the shadow of his own choices. His exit was not that of a defeated man, but of a ghost retreating from his own funeral party, leaving behind the wreckage of a life built on the sand of lies. The silence that followed his departure was heavier and more condemning than any scream. Rick's exit left a vacuum on the stage, a black hole that sucked all the energy from the ballroom. The audience's hum of shock gave way to a contained pandemonium. Reporters, previously kept at a distance, surged forward like a tide, shouting questions that tumbled over each other. Camera flashes exploded, trying to capture the face of the newly revealed heir, the expression of the cleaning woman who brought down an empire, the perplexity on the faces of the lawyers. Leonard felt like a castaway thrown onto an unknown, hostile shore. The reality of his new life hit him not as a wave of euphoria over the inherited fortune, but as the crushing weight of a responsibility he never wanted. He looked at the lights, at the curious faces, and felt a cold panic. The name Sterling, which he had carried discreetly all his life, was now a label, a brand, a set of assets and liabilities he would have to manage. He didn't want a business. He wanted a father. And all he found were the wreckage of a war fought before he arrived. Isabel Matthews, the lawyer, tried to form a protective barrier. "Ladies and gentlemen, no questions for now. We will issue an official statement tomorrow." But her voice was lost in the noise. Mrs. Dolores, sensing Leonard's distress, placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of support that anchored him amidst the storm. "Take it easy, son. The truth is powerful, but sometimes it is heavy." But before they could think of a strategic retreat, a new movement in the audience silenced the chaos. It was Beatrice, Rick's wife, the woman everyone expected to faint or flee in tears, walked toward the stage. Her expression was not one of shame or defeat. There was a steely determination in her eyes, a strength no one had ever suspected she possessed. She climbed the steps, her high-fashion dress seeming like armor. She didn't look at Leonard or the lawyers, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Dolores, and there was an ancient pain in them. "Dolores," Beatrice said, her voice firm, amplified by the microphone Dolores still held, "what you said is true, but you only told half the story." A new silence. deeper and tenser than the previous one, fell over the ballroom. "What my husband did was wrong. It was unforgivable, and he will pay for it," Beatrice continued, every word heavy with conviction. "But you need to know why." She turned to Leonard. "Your father, Arthur, was no saint. In his last years, after the illness weakened him, he became a bitter, cruel man. He couldn't stand to see that the company he founded only became an empire in Rick's hands. He was jealous of the man he himself created." The revelation was shocking, staining the image of the benevolent founder. Arthur threatened to destroy everything, to sell the company to rivals, liquidate the assets, just so Rick wouldn't get anything. The search for you, Leonard, was not an act of paternal love. It was the last act of revenge by an old, resentful man to take everything away from the one he had grown to hate. The audience held its breath. The simple narrative of good versus evil was falling apart. Beatrice then opened her small, elegant clutch purse and pulled out not a document, but a man's leather wallet, worn and aged by time. Arthur gave this wallet to Rick the day he promoted him to manager. "The day of that photo," she said, her voice strained. "A month before he died, he took it back, said my husband wasn't worthy to carry it." She opened the wallet. Inside, there was no money, only a secret compartment. With trembling fingers, she pulled out a tiny, folded, fragile photograph. She held it up for everyone to see, and the camera zoomed in, projecting the image onto the screen. The photo showed a teenage Rick, his face dirty and his eyes full of despair, next to a sickly, emaciated woman lying on a makeshift bed. It was the image of absolute misery, the image of Rick's mother, days before she died. The image on the screen was a punch to the gut of the gala's opulence. The contrast between the party's luxury and the raw misery of that photograph was obscene. That teenager in the photo, with his protruding bones and a gaze that was a mixture of fear and fury, had nothing to do with the polished, arrogant CEO everyone knew. It was the image of the nothing Rick always boasted of having come from, but the reality was infinitely darker than his rhetoric of overcoming adversity. That photo wasn't a story of honorable poverty. It was a testament to abandonment and despair. The murmur that swept through the audience was no longer one of condemnation for Rick, but of deep discomfort, a sudden and uncomfortable empathy. The narrative had complicated. The lines between victim and villain had become blurred and indistinct. The fraudulent billionaire had a past, a wound, a reason. Beatrice allowed the image to hang in the air for a moment, letting its impact deepen. Rick had no father. His mother raised him alone, sick, cleaning floors for food, she said, her voice low but carrying a weight that forced everyone to listen. He watched her waste away, humiliated, begging for help that never came. He was 15 when she passed. He swore that day he would never be weak again. He swore he would have so much money, so much fortune, that he would never have to bow to anyone. The confession was intimate, almost a violation, but it was the only weapon Beatrice had to defend the man she still saw, despite everything behind the monster's mask. When he met Arthur, he saw the father he never had. The love and gratitude he felt were real. Arthur's investment in him wasn't just financial, it was emotional. He gave Rick purpose, a chance to bury that hungry boy in the photo. Mrs. Dolores listened to everything, her face a mask of pain. She remembered that boy. She remembered Arthur talking about the intense young man he had hired, a boy with a hunger to win that bordered on savagery. She remembered the genuine affection that united the two, a father-son relationship that transcended business. And she also remembered the change, the coldness that began to settle between them, the closed-door arguments, the increasing bitterness in Arthur's gaze. Beatrice's version didn't invalidate hers. It merely added layers of tragedy to a story she thought was simple. Her quest for justice for Arthur had perhaps ignored Rick's pain. Leonard was stunned. The figure of his father, whom he had idealized as a betrayed hero, now gained the contours of a fallible, bitter, perhaps even cruel man. The search for his roots had led him into a labyrinth of complex emotions and contradictory truths. The inheritance that had landed in his lap was not just an empire of goods and assets, it was a legacy of resentment, envy, and pain. He looked at Beatrice, a woman desperately fighting to rehumanize her husband in the eyes of the world, and saw a loyalty that moved him. Then he looked at Mrs. Dolores, the guardian of his father's promises, and saw the purity of a righteous mission. And finally, he thought of Rick, hidden in the darkness backstage, the hungry boy who became a king and in the process, devoured his own soul. "I'm not justifying what he did," Beatrice concluded, her voice firm again, pulling everyone's attention back to her. "The theft, the lie, that is unforgivable. But the story didn't start with his greed. It started with his pain, and with the cruelty of a man who promised to be a father and then tried to take everything away. Not for justice, but for wounded pride." She put the wallet back into her purse, a gesture of finality. "Now you know not the whole story, perhaps, but you know there is not just one monster and one saint in this room." With that, she turned and, with the same dignity with which she had ascended, descended the steps of the stage and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a silence even deeper, full of doubt and a sadness that now seemed to belong to everyone. Beatrice's exit was like a receding wave, leaving the shore covered in emotional debris. The grand ballroom, once the stage for a unanimous condemnation, was now a sea of confused faces. Moral certainty had dissolved, giving way to a fog of ambiguity. People looked at each other, seeking an answer, a way to process the avalanche of revelations. The financial scandal, something concrete and easy to judge, had transformed into a dense and painful family drama. The stock value and the fate of the Sterling Group's assets seemed, for a moment, less important than the open wounds in those three intertwined lives: Arthur, Rick, and Leonard. The story was no longer about a theft of fortune, but about a theft of affection, about broken promises, and the way pain, when left untreated, can turn into a poison that corrupts everything it touches. On the stage, Leonard felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He had come prepared for a legal battle to claim a right, an inheritance. He was not prepared to inherit a tragedy. The figure of his father, once an idealized silhouette, was now that of a complex man, capable of great generosity and equally deep bitterness. And Rick, the villain of his story, was now the victim of another, a broken boy who rebuilt himself with the wrong materials. How could he completely hate a man whose initial pain mirrored his own, the pain of a fatherless childhood? That empire, with its multi-million-dollar deals and constant cash flow, was a monument built on emotionally unstable ground, and now the cracks were exposed for all to see. Mrs. Dolores approached him, her eyes teary. I didn't know about that photo," she whispered, her voice weak. "Arthur never told me that part of Rick's story." There was guilt in her voice, the burden of having acted on an incomplete truth. Her loyalty to Arthur had blinded her to the suffering on the other side of the equation. She fulfilled her promise, but at what cost? The justice she sought had brought forth more pain, more chaos, and perhaps no peace. She looked at the crowd, at the media vultures still circling, and felt a sudden revulsion for it all. This was not a victory, it was a wake. Isabel Matthews, the lawyer, maintained her professional composure, but even she seemed shaken. "Leonard, we need to get out of here," she said quietly. "Tomorrow, with cool heads, we will decide the next steps. The legal issue remains the same, but the narrative has changed completely." She was right. The battle in the courts would be fought based on documents and evidence, the will, the DNA, the witnesses. But the battle for the company's soul, for its future, would be fought on that new terrain of moral complexity. It was no longer about simply removing a fraudulent CEO. It was about deciding what to do with the toxic legacy left by two broken men. Leonard nodded, mute. He allowed Isabel and a security guard to guide him off the stage, through a side door, away from the flashes and questions. Mrs. Dolores followed them, a silent shadow of regret. As they walked down a cold, impersonal service corridor, the sounds of the party dying behind them, Leonard stopped. He turned to Dolores. Do you think Rick is okay?" he asked, the genuine concern in his voice surprising himself. He could no longer see Rick only as the man who stole his inheritance. He saw the teenager in the photo, the young attendant, the man who cried in his father's arms. He saw a distorted reflection of himself. "Mrs." Dolores shook her head, her eyes filled with infinite sadness. "No one who builds a castle on pain can be okay, my son. He is lost. And the truth is, I think he has been lost for a very long time." The sentence hung in the quiet corridor, an epitaph for the ruin they had just witnessed. The night that was supposed to celebrate 20 years of success had turned into the exposure of 30 years of suffering, away from the ballroom lights. In the backstage area, smelling of dust and electrical equipment, Rick found refuge in his private dressing room, a small space he used to prepare before major events. It was a functional area with a mirror surrounded by bulbs, a leather couch, and a small fridge stocked with imported water. But tonight, the walls seemed to shrink, the room transforming into a cell. He stripped off the expensive tuxedo, letting it fall crumpled to the floor, like discarded snakeskin. Wearing only his linen shirt and trousers, he looked at himself in the mirror, but he didn't see the CEO, the multi-millionaire. He saw the reflection of the boy in the photo, his eyes haunted, hunger etched into his soul. Beatrice's voice, defending him, echoed in his mind. She had tried to save him, showing the world his original wound. But the compassion of others was a balm that burned. He didn't want pity. Pity was what people felt for the weak, the needy, and he had spent his whole life fleeing that feeling. He slumped onto the leather couch, the cool material against his feverish skin. The words of Dolores, Leonard, Beatrice, the image of the photo, everything blended into a chaotic whirlwind in his head. The narrative he had built for himself, that of a self-made man, was armor forged to protect that skinny, frightened boy from the world's humiliation. And now that armor was in pieces. He remembered Arthur's betrayal. He remembered the pain, the fury upon realizing that the paternal love he so cherished was conditional, attached to his success, but limited so that it would never eclipse the Creator. Arthur couldn't stand that his creation became greater than him. The decision to take the company wasn't a cold calculation, at least not at first. It was an act of self-preservation, a desperate blow to prevent the man he loved as a father from destroying him, sending him back to the misery he came from. But self-preservation turned into greed, fear turned into arrogance, and along the way, he got lost. He thought about his assets, the numbers, the spreadsheets, the growth charts. He thought about the stocks, the investment funds, the profitability of his ventures. Those were his gods. He believed that accumulating wealth would protect him from all pain, all vulnerability. He kept part of his fortune in cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin, something he saw as the future of money, decentralized and anonymous, just as he wished his past could be. But now he realized the devastating truth. His immense capital was useless. It couldn't buy back his honor. It couldn't erase the betrayal. It couldn't heal the wound of that boy in the mirror. His wealth was merely a pile of paper and digital numbers that couldn't fill the void in his chest. He hadn't built an empire. He had built the most elaborate and solitary of prisons. A sound pulled him from his stupor. Someone was gently knocking on the dressing room door. "Rick?" The voice was Charles's, his partner, the last person he wanted to see. Charles wouldn't come to offer consolation. He would come to talk business, damage control, how to save what was left of the wreckage. Rick, open the door. We need to talk about the company's future. About the assets, the liabilities, about what we do when the market opens. Rick closed his eyes. The company's future. He had sacrificed everything for it, and now it meant nothing. He ignored the knock, which became more insistent. He had no more answers. The map he had used to navigate his entire life had proven false. He was adrift in an ocean of failure, and for the first time he had no idea what his next move would be. Silence was his only reply, the echo of his own desolation. Across town, in a modest but cozy apartment in the Virginia Highland neighborhood, Leonard was trying to process the night that had turned his life upside down. The smell of fresh coffee, brewed by Mrs. Dolores, filled the small kitchen, a familiar and comforting aroma amidst the chaos of his thoughts. Isabel Matthews was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open, already analyzing the first online repercussions of the scandal. The internet was an uncontrollable firestorm of speculation and judgment. The sterling name was the trending topic, an avalanche of opinions dissecting the lives of his father, Rick, and now his own. He, who had always lived an anonymous life as a history teacher, was now a public figure, the lost heir, the center of a dispute over a fortune that felt more like a curse. He looked out the window at the lights of Atlanta, the city that now housed both his future and a past he barely knew. The initial reaction is divided, Isabel said, without taking her eyes off the screen. Many are on your side, seeing you as the victim. But Beatrice's story changed the tone. Now there's a current of sympathy for Rick, painting Arthur as the villain. They're pitting you against each other. Leonard, the rightful heir versus the tortured genius. The media is going to love this narrative. Leonard sighed. He didn't want to be part of any narrative. He just wanted to understand. What about the company? He asked, the words sounding strange in his mouth. Legally, we have a solid case to annul the stock transfer. We can assume control, Isabel replied. But the question is, what do we do afterward? The company is Rick's image. Without him, market confidence could crumble. We'll need a plan. And fast. Mrs. Dolores approached and placed a cup of coffee in front of him. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly. I'm so sorry, Leonard, she said, her voice strained. I just wanted to honor the promise I made to your father. I wanted the truth to come out, but the truth, it's much more complicated than I thought. There was deep pain in her eyes, the pain of someone who realizes their best intentions can have devastating consequences. Maybe I judged Rick too harshly. I saw the greed, but I didn't see the wound behind it. Leonard covered her hand with his. You did what you thought was right, Dolores. You did what my father asked. He paused, Beatrice's words echoing in his mind. But maybe my father was wrong too. Maybe he and Rick were trapped in a cycle of pain and pride, and the company was just the battlefield. He took a sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. The story wasn't about money or business, it was about fatherhood, about a father he never had, and about another man who lost the father figure he found. And he, Leonard, was in the middle, inheriting not just the material goods, but the unresolved emotional conflict. Isabel, he said, with a sudden decision in his voice, I don't want to destroy Rick, and I don't want to simply take what is rightfully mine. That doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like a solution. Isabel looked at him, surprised. What are you suggesting? I don't know yet, Leonard admitted, but I need to talk to him. Not with lawyers present, not with the press watching, just him and me. This story began with two men, my father and him. Maybe it needs to end with two others. The idea was risky, perhaps naive, but it seemed the only way out of that labyrinth. He didn't want to win a war. He wanted, if possible, to find a path to peace, to end a cycle of suffering that had lasted 30 years. He needed to look into the eyes of the man who stole his father and his inheritance, and understand not necessarily to forgive, but to free himself from the weight of that legacy. The next day, Atlanta woke up with the scandal plastered across all the headlines. Sterling Group shares plummeted at the stock exchange opening, a capital hemorrhage that reflected the established crisis of confidence. Charles and the other partners were in emergency mode, trying to issue statements to calm the market, but it was like trying to stop a tsunami with a bucket. Rick's name, once synonymous with profit and yield, was now an anathema. While the business world stirred in panic, Rick remained isolated in his mansion in the Buckhead neighborhood, a fortress of glass and concrete that now felt like a tomb. Beatrice had spent the night in the guest room. The silence between them was heavier than any argument. He wasn't answering calls, not replying to messages. He was alone with his ghosts, drowning in the silence of his failure. It was late afternoon when the intercom rang. The maid, hesitantly, announced that Leonard Sterling was at the gate and asked to come in, alone. The request was so unexpected that Rick, for an instant, thought it was a trap, a new public humiliation. But curiosity, or perhaps a remnant of something he couldn't name, made him agree. "Let him in," he said, his voice hoarse. He waited in the living room, a vast, minimalist space decorated with priceless artwork, but which now seemed cold and lifeless. He didn't stand up when Leonard entered. He remained seated in a designer armchair, his posture rigid, the mask of arrogance re-erected, however fragile. Leonard stopped a few feet away. The environment was intimidating, but he maintained his characteristic calm. He didn't come as an enemy. "I didn't bring lawyers," Leonard said, his calm voice echoing in the silence of the room. "I didn't come to talk about the will, about the shares, or about the money." Rick stared at him, his eyes bloodshot, distrust etched on his face. "What do you want, then? Did you come to savor your victory? To see me destroyed?" There was a tremor in his voice, the rage barely disguising the despair. "No," Leonard said simply. "I came because I think we both lost the same person in different ways." The phrase disarmed Rick. He expected accusations, threats, negotiations. He didn't expect connection. "You know nothing about him," Rick retorted, but without the same conviction. "I knew him. I worked with him. I saw him build the beginning of all this. And you are just a name on a piece of paper." "That's true," Leonard agreed. "He is just a photograph to me, a story told by Mrs. Dolores. I never had the chance to know him. You did. You had a father in him, and you threw it away." The accusation was direct, but it wasn't said with anger. It was said with a sadness that mirrored Leonard's own loss. It was at that moment that the dam of Rick's control finally broke. The arrogance dissolved, the rage dissipated, and what remained was raw pain, the pain of that 15-year-old boy. "He threw me away first," Rick shouted, jumping up, his face contorted with anguish. "He loved me as long as I was his creation, his shadow. The moment I became bigger, the moment the company under my command became an empire he never dreamed of, he couldn't stand it. His pride couldn't stand it. He wanted to destroy me, humiliate me, send me back to nothing." The tears, which he had held back for 30 years, finally came, burning his face. "I loved him, God, how I loved him. And he betrayed me. He betrayed me." He collapsed back into the armchair, his body shaken by sobs, the powerful billionaire reduced to the abandoned boy he had always been inside. Leonard watched, his heart heavy. He didn't see a thief. He saw a man drowning in his own pain. And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, Leonard stepped forward and did the only thing that felt right. He extended his hand, not to take, but to offer. Leonard's hand remained extended in the air, a silent invitation amidst Rick's storm of sobs. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness, nor of absolution. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a link between two men scarred by the same absence. Rick looked at that hand, and then at Leonard's face. He saw in his eyes not the arrogance of a victor, but the compassion of someone who understood in a different way the depth of that wound. Slowly, as if the movement required superhuman strength, he raised his own trembling hand and shook it. The handshake was firm, a contact that transcended the dispute over the inheritance. In that instant, they were no longer the usurper and the heir. They were just two sons of Arthur Sterling, each dealing with the complicated legacy he had left behind. "I don't want your ruin." "Rick," Leonard said, his voice low but firm, "but I also cannot ignore the truth. The company needs to be restored, not just financially, but morally." Rick nodded, unable to speak, his throat still tight from crying. He released Leonard's hand and composed himself, wiping his face with the back of his hands, a gesture stripped of any vanity. What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice weak. "I am going to assume my place in the company. It is my right, and now I feel it is my responsibility," Leonard replied. "But the company is much bigger than both of us. It is made up of thousands of employees, of families who depend on it. Destroying it out of vengeance would be betraying my father's memory, just as much as you betrayed his trust." A proposal began to form in Leonard's mind, a solution that wasn't about winning or losing, but about rebuilding. "You built this empire, Rick. Your genius for business is undeniable. Even if your methods were wrong, the Sterling Group needs you." Rick looked at him, incredulous. "But how? After everything? You will no longer be the CEO, nor the owner. You will step away from all executive positions," Leonard continued, clearly setting the conditions. "There will be a new board of directors. I will be on the board as the majority heir. And you will transfer every share, every asset that was diverted, back into the company's capital." It was a complete surrender, the loss of all the power, all the fortune he had accumulated. Rick expected the final blow, the humiliating expulsion, but what came next surprised him. "However," Leonard said, "I want you to remain as a senior strategic consultant, a position without decision-making power, but where your experience can be used to guide the company through the transition. And part of the future dividends, a fair percentage, will be yours, not as an owner, but as payment for your work. An income, not a fortune." The proposal was revolutionary. It wasn't punishment, it was redemption. It offered Rick a chance to repair the damage, to use his talent for good, to rebuild his honor instead of wallowing in shame. At that moment, Beatrice entered the room, drawn by the sound of voices. She paused at the door, observing the scene. She saw the exhaustion on her husband's face, but also a glimpse of something new, something she hadn't seen in years. Relief. Rick looked at her, and then back at Leonard. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do that?" "Because Mrs. Dolores told me. My father believed the best investment was in a good man," Leonard said, echoing the words she had used on stage. "He was mistaken about you once, and you lost your way. Maybe it's time to prove that his original gamble wasn't a complete mistake. Maybe it's time for you to become the man he believed you could be." The offer of a second chance, something he never imagined possible, was more valuable than all the Bitcoin and dollars he had ever owned. It was the chance to rewrite the ending of his own story. The transition at the Sterling Group was an earthquake in the corporate world, but a controlled earthquake. In a carefully orchestrated press conference, Leonard, flanked by Isabel Matthews and a visibly shaken but dignified Rick, announced the new company structure. The truth was laid bare, without euphemisms. The fraudulent transfer was admitted, and Leonard's possession as majority shareholder was legitimized. Rick publicly resigned from all his positions, apologizing not only to Arthur's memory, but to every employee and investor. The news was shocking, But the proposed solution, Rick remaining as a consultant, the creation of a charity fund in Arthur Sterling's name to finance the education of underprivileged youth, and Leonard's commitment to transparent management, was seen as an act of maturity and wisdom. The drop in shares was stopped, and slowly confidence began to be rebuilt, now on a foundation of honesty. Months passed. Everyone's life found a new rhythm. Leonard, with the help of Mrs. Dolores, who became his unofficial advisor and the soul of the Charity Institute, immersed himself in learning about the empire he had inherited. He didn't have Rick's business acumen, but he had something perhaps more valuable: empathy. He visited the construction sites, talked to the employees, and his decisions were guided not only by cash flow, but by human impact. The company, under his influence, began investing in social projects, balancing profit with purpose. He never felt entirely comfortable in the business world, but he found his place as the guardian of a legacy, determined to make it something his father, with all his flaws, could be proud of. Rick, for his part, lived an internal exile. He lost the mansion, the luxury car, the symbols of his power. He and Beatrice moved to an elegant but much more modest condo. The loss of fortune was a blow, but also a liberation. Without the pressure of maintaining an image, he began to rediscover himself. Initially, his role as a consultant was tense, but gradually, his genuine passion for the company spoke louder. His analyses and strategies, stripped of arrogance and greed, were brilliant. He and Leonard developed a relationship of mutual respect, cautious but real. They met weekly, and their conversations, which began about the company's treasury or new ventures, frequently strayed to the past, to Arthur, filling in each other's gaps. Rick found in his new role a form of penance and, eventually, peace. One sunny Saturday afternoon, a year after the gala night, Leonard and Rick met at the small service station where it all began. Now renovated but maintained as a historical landmark of the company, Mrs. Dolores was with them. Together, they inaugurated the first scholarship of the Arthur Sterling Institute. The first recipient was an intelligent and ambitious young man who worked as a pump jockey right there. As the emotional young man thanked them for the opportunity, Rick felt a lump in his throat. He saw himself in that young man, saw the same hunger to succeed. He approached the boy, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, his voice husky, "Work hard, be honest, and never forget who extended a hand to you." It was the advice he wished he had given himself. In that moment, looking at Leonard, who smiled beside Mrs. Dolores, Rick understood the true nature of wealth. It wasn't in the bank balances, nor the assets, nor the stock value. It was in human connection, in the capacity to repair, in the chance to start over. He was no longer a billionaire, but he felt richer than ever. The fortune he had stolen almost destroyed him, but the inheritance he was forced to return in a way saved him. Together, the three looked toward the future, not as enemies or rivals, but as the unlikely guardians of a legacy, rebuilt on the ruins of pain and cemented by the strength of perseverance and forgiveness.